Welcome to Carrickfergus Vineyard, a place of hope where lives are changing. We're a church in the heart of Carrickfergus, passionate about seeing people's lives changed by the love of Jesus. The following message was given at one of our Sunday services.
It's time. It's coming. We are in Mark chapter 15, this journey that we've been on for a number of weeks now. This is the end of the road. This is the end of the journey for Jesus. And over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've looked at those events that have unfolded a week before he's come on a donkey, and everyone's gone absolutely ballistic. They've gone nuts celebrating the coming of the King. And over days, he's preached, he's argued, he's wrestled with the priests, the teachers of the law. He's gone out to his digs, to his friends out in Bethany, and he's come back day after day after day. And popularity has arisen, and questions and things have been asked of him. He has celebrated the Passover feast with his 12 disciples. The feast, the celebration, which usually would be an incredible, wonderful celebration of what God had done through Moses. But yet this celebratory meal is a somber occasion. Jesus takes the bread, he takes the wine, and he says, instead of the way in which we've celebrated this for generations, I give you a new way, a new covenant. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you, is what he describes to his followers. During the same meal, he says, one of you will betray me and one of you will deny me. And they're looking at each other as if to say, is it you? Is it me? Judas scarpers off. He goes into the dark of night. He goes, gets the chief priests or the servants, the guard of the temple guard. Jesus takes the remaining 11 to the garden. He takes his closest 3 into the garden. They fall asleep on many occasions. And Jesus pours out his heart one last time before the Father. Is there another way? Is there another way? Not my will, but your will be done. And he chooses the cross. They leave the garden. Judas has come, betrays him with a kiss. He is taken in the middle of the night to an assembly of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And they find just some way in which to get rid of him. One way to silence him. And during this interrogation, this questioning, Jesus says to them, I am the Messiah. I am. And you'll see me on the clouds coming in glory. And so too the next day we find ourselves in Mark chapter 15. If you've got your Bible, follow along, write in all your notes. Otherwise, hopefully the words will come up on the screen. Let's read together. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Side note, read the other Gospels. We love Mark, but he's brief. He's brief in his account, and I'd encourage you, especially many of us, as we move towards Easter, make this your goal, to read the other Gospels as we approach the death and resurrection of Jesus. Especially read Luke and John. They give us a much fuller picture of what's going on. And Mark's version really is the headlines. But if you want to watch and get the whole news, then read those as well. But for context, the Jewish leaders themselves, they were not permitted to sentence someone to death. They didn't have that within their power or their jurisdiction. But they wanted, nonetheless, to kill Jesus. That was their intention. But they needed their Roman oppressors, of which they hated. They needed them in order to cast the death sentence as it was. Now, Pilate, who was the Roman governor, he would not have put a native Jew for trial on his life simply because he had violated Jewish law. This was known as a religious matter. And so we've got these two things going on. In fact, in John 18:31, Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." In the eyes of the Jewish leaders, Jesus has been found guilty of blasphemy in claiming to be the Messiah. And that's what we looked at last week. But for Rome to kill him, the Jewish people, the chief priests, they needed a different narrative. They needed a different story or a different reason that gave Rome the reason in order to kill Jesus. And so early in the morning, they bind him or tether him to make him look like a criminal. And they lead him towards Pilate. And the basis for death that the priests have come to convict Rome is to take the line that Jesus oppressed Rome. And to do this, they accused Jesus of being a king. And that was the charge or the conviction in which the Jewish priests put to Pilate. Because if he was to be a king, that would give Rome grounds in order to get rid of him. Why? Because it would be in competition or overthrow the king who in that time, in that area, was King Herod. If Jesus claims to be a king, he is guilty of a crime against Rome. And so here we read in these opening verses, Pilate asks him the question. He says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies by saying, "You have said so," inferring, "If you say so." Or in reply to the same question in John's account, Jesus says, "Is that your own idea?" He's saying this to Pilate. "Or did others talk to you about me?" is a question in which Jesus replies to his question. If we read this carefully and we just look at the narrative there, the black and the red, no, I've changed it. I'm talking to myself. I've changed my slides and I haven't given you the full version, and there would be red lines there which would help you as the audience. It helps me as I look at my screen, but it doesn't really help you. Move on, Paul, you're wittering on like an old man. If we read this more closely, Pilate asks him the question, implying that it has already been said to him. They have already gone behind the scenes and said to Pilate, "This guy here, this criminal that we have led you towards you, he is claiming to be a king." And Jesus replies, he says, "If you say so." Is that your own idea? Chief priests, they remain present within this conversation or within this interrogation, as it were. And they accuse him of many things which we don't necessarily get privy to because it's not recorded. To Pilate's amazement, Jesus doesn't answer. Why? Why is he not speaking up? Why is he not defending himself? He doesn't need to. He's already resigned to the fact that what's coming is coming. But let's be really clear at this moment. Jesus is innocent. And Pilate knows it. In fact, Luke tells us that he says to the chief priests and to the crowds, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." And so we continue reading. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowds came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So in this passage, this bit, we're introduced now to Barabbas. He's already been found guilty of murder, and he too is due to be executed alongside with the other two, which do get crucified eventually alongside Jesus. Now, for context, it was common in that time to have such a public kind of trial go on. And so crowds would gather, and people would come forwards, and the Roman governor, who acts almost like as a single judge, and the crowds, they would call out, and they would jeer, and they would say things. And in this moment, we learn that the crowds have gathered, and they're saying, would you do for us what you do for us each year at this time of this festival? And he would know. He would say, that's to release someone. I'm going to be kind. It's Easter time. It's not Easter time. It's Passover time. I'm going to release someone. And Pilate naturally thinks, oh, of course they're asking me this. The crowd are asking me to release someone because they want their Jesus back. Because he's this special guy. They want this Jesus back because actually he's done nothing wrong. Barabbas, the murderer, he deserves death. But no, the crowds, they call back and they shout back and they say, no, free Barabbas. We want him to be free. What do you want me to do with Jesus? We want you to crucify him, is what we read in the text from Mark. Now, again, these are the headlines. I urge you to read Luke 23 and John 19. Their accounts are much more detailed. Luke tells us that Pilate actually sends Jesus to King Herod. And Herod actually has a similar conversation, interrogates, asks questions, and neither Herod nor Pilate had anything, any grounds, anything that was legitimate or any reason to actually sentence Jesus to death or to crucify him. Mark records that Pilate asks, what shall I do with him? They say, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Certainly from the passages in Luke and John, Pilate doesn't want to crucify him. He's no reason to. What crime has he committed? Another thing to throw in the mix is something that we only read about in Matthew's gospel, and it's to do with Pilate's wife. In Matthew we read 27:19, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. How interesting. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read the scriptures and we come across these things, it stops me in my tracks, and I'm a bit like, gosh, instead of just reading it and going, oh, whatever, these are opportunities to camp out and to consider and to ponder what's going on. She's had this dream, and she's disturbed by the dream. And she sends word in the middle of a public trial to her husband saying, listen, you don't want anything. You don't want to be held accountable for anything towards this Jesus guy, this holy man, this innocent man. Stay clear. I'm warning you, darling, to just stay clear because I've had this disturbing dream. What was the content of the dream? Where did the dream come from? Now, no one really knows. And scholars have argued. On the one hand, the dream, the origin or the context of the dream came from God as a warning to Pilate about this innocent man, his son. And yet, there's also other scholars would argue and would debate over it that the dream, its origin came from the enemy, that came from the devil in order to stop what was required of Jesus in terms of the crucifixion. Open to debate. Not in this context, not now. Answers on a postcard. paul@carrickfergusvineyard.org. Regardless, she, Pilate's wife, and her husband were uncomfortable with the dealings that came to his title and his position. He has to make a decision. But he knows that the whole thing was a sham. And according to what is written in verse 10, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But he was nonetheless under pressure to make a decision. The chief priests, they've stirred up the crowds. A man named Barabbas is presented alongside Jesus. Pilate wants to release Jesus and is perplexed at the crowd's desire to be the one released. And so finally, verse 15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So instead of the murderer driven by his own desire and self, another driven by love for others takes his place and is sentenced to death. I've always been baffled by this. For years, as I remember as a young fella being really baffled by the crowd's desire for Jesus to be crucified. And yet a week before, the crowds gathered and they cut palm tree branches and they laid their cloaks in homage to this Jesus. Now, we can't know for sure that it was the same crowd, that the same people were in those different crowds. So we can't necessarily know that. But how public opinion of this one person had changed so dramatically. And I guess the application really for our lives is, don't follow the crowd. Who's watched Traitors? There's some hands that want to go up, but you don't want to admit it. Get round the round table. Don't really know who's a traitor or not. Such and such says that person. Oh, we haven't got a better idea. Yeah, we'll all jump on board and we all follow the crowd and we all vote that person and they stand up and they go, I'm a faithful. And everyone's going, oh, no, afterwards. So easy, isn't it, to just to follow the crowd in life. We see it not just with children in the classroom who are growing up just trying to fit in, but we see it in ourselves as grown adults. We just simply follow the crowd. Even worse sometimes when we know not to. So, Jesus' fate is now in the hand of the Roman soldiers. And we read verse 16 onwards. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, Hail, King of the Jews! Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spat on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. When they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe, put on his clothes, and they led him out to crucify him. The preceding verse 15 says that Pilate had him flogged and then handed him over to be crucified. In John's account, Pilate had him flogged first and then brought back out on trial to the crowds, bloodied and stained. And then it was when they shouted, crucify him. Regardless of how it happened, he first was flogged. He was sentenced to a flogging. And it happened in the Praetorium where Jesus was flogged before his crucifixion. A whole company of soldiers could have been up to as many as 600 men. Can you imagine a lonesome person, wrongly convicted, brought before 600 men? Now, if you've watched the Mel Gibson movie many years ago now, The Passion, you will have seen the most grotesque and brutal flogging. In fact, it's what stands out in my memory of watching the movie, more so than the crucifixion itself. It is utterly, utterly brutal. A person would be tied to a post or a pillar, and they would have been flogged by the Roman soldiers by a whip called a flagellum. Flagellum would have been no ordinary whip. It would have been leather tethers. And on the ends of the tethers would be bones or pieces of metal tied in, interwoven within the leather. And whenever the person's back is beaten with it, the metal and the bones would stick into a person's back, into their flesh, and would kind of catch. And then as the whip is then brought back towards the person, it would be utterly gruesome as strips of skin is removed from the person's back. This flogging or scourging was a customary preliminary procedure given to those that would be crucified. This reminds us of what we read in Isaiah 53 and what Peter reminds us in 1 Peter 2. We read in Isaiah 53 a prophecy hundreds of years before it happened. But he, Jesus, was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our wickedness. The punishment required for our well-being fell on him. And by his stripes, the physical stripes which were left marked on his back, by his stripes, his wounds, we are healed. Sometimes this very act itself was enough to kill a person. In the very least, it certainly would have weakened a person greatly. Enormous trauma and blood that was lost. But if the physical pain wasn't enough, consider just for a moment how awful the jeering of all the company of soldiers that watched it. The words that were spoken, the staff that was beaten, to be spat upon and knelt down in homage towards him, the utter humiliation. My story, which I'm about to share, is pitiful in comparison to it. But when I was 14 years of age, I've shared this story before. I was playing for my school team against another team in Watford. We were playing basketball, and during the game, bit of argy-bargy between me and a boy from the other school. And he was giving it all the lip, and he was like, all right then, all right. In the changing rooms afterwards then, and because I was 14, I said, yeah, all right then. Thinking, Paul, you've never been in a fight in your life. You're not likely to take matters into your own hands, but you don't want to look small and you want to be big and tall and cool. So anyway, the match was over. We won, which was the best thing of the night. We went into the change rooms, and I'm there. All my mates are here, and all the other team, they're here. And this lad comes across to me. He's like, right, okay, let's go. And I was like, we're not going anywhere, son. And I literally stand there, and he literally smacks me in the face on the top. It was either side. I can't remember which side. It was either side. And I was like, oh, gosh, that hurt. And then, like, he was just egging me on, wanted a fight. And I am a passive man. Like, genuinely, in that situation, I was not for taking matters in my hands. And he hit me again. Same place. Hit me again. Same place. And during this time, what was going on, 5 times he hit me. And each time I just stood there. That was a bit stupid as well, but I did. But what was worse were there were 2 other boys up on the bench in the boys' changing rooms. So they were up higher, looking over it. And this one boy, who I remember his name, not going to speak it publicly. He might listen to the podcast and get in touch. Chances of that would be funny, wouldn't it? But this boy wasn't even the one doing the punching. He was the one giving it all the lip, egging on, urging on the other one to be smacking me. And this friend, this other guy, was a friend of mine because I played football with him in a district and county team with him. So actually he was a teammate, but he was egging on his school friend to be actually punching me. And of all the people I actually wanted to take matters into my own hands in, it was the one giving it the lip, not the person punching me in the face. And the point I'm making again is the same as earlier in terms of following the crowd. Being in the company of others, just getting alongside. It's easy to stand alongside a mob or a crowd. And in that moment, in this moment, in utter isolation, torment, anger, and hatred, Jesus is mocked and ridiculed. A purple robe is put on him, which signifies royalty. A crown of thorns is put onto his head. Hail, King of the Jews! They beat him, they spit on him, they fall to their knees. in front of so many. Jesus, a Jew, in the company of hundreds of angry Roman men. Awful. Then we read, verse 21 to 26. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, what a great name, Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, was passing by. He's just happened to be in Jerusalem, passing by. And they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." As ever, Mark is brief in his writing, but boy, there's a lot packed into this. Executions of criminals was a public affair. It served its purpose for 2 main reasons. One, the punishment, the victim, prolonged death, as a person would die very, very slowly over hours, sometimes days, as the person would slowly die of asphyxiation. The second reason it was such a public thing is that it served as a warning to deter others towards criminal activity. The person is meant to carry their own crossbeam, which is known as a patibulum, the crossbeam section, which is then taken to the site where the person is crucified. It's at that point where the straight vertical section is already in its place. They are meant to carry this through the streets in public humiliation so that many, many can see the victim, the person who is due to be crucified. Mark does not tell us why Jesus doesn't carry his own cross, but we can assume he's been badly wounded, badly beaten, and he is unable physically to have the physical strength in order to carry it. Mark is clear to name the person who gets to carry it in his place. His name is Simon, who's from a town called Cyrene. He also names his 2 children. Why does Mark give us such details about a person? Why does he not just say some random bloke did that? It leads us to these questions when we read the scriptures. Why is that important? Most likely, not totally, because we don't totally know, but most likely is that Simon became a Christian, as did his whole household, and would therefore be known to its earlier readers of Mark's gospel. They would have been known to them, which is why Mark chooses to list their names. But Jesus is unable to carry his own cross. And an interesting point that is written about this is this. One of the profound paradoxes of Christianity is to be found in the fact that the one who was not able to carry his own cross is the one who enables us to carry ours. And so to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Mark uses the place of the skull again for the context of his Greek readers, but the name was given actually most likely because of the geography of the land. This is known, you can Google this and Google images. There's other images of the same thing, but the hillside has the side there, what would be with 2 caves there, the eyes would be seen as a place of the skull. And there's other really cool images that you can look at this. An apt name for the site of execution. Interestingly, Mark doesn't go into detail about the crucifixion itself. Doesn't need to, because to his earliest readers, crucifixion was common. People knew of it, knew of its practice, and knew of how it happened. However, what Mark does give us is some interesting details. There's 3 things which we're going to briefly share and then come into land. There are 3 details that Mark does give us in this last bit of passage, which gives us some significant theological insight. Firstly, Jesus refuses to drink the wine that's offered to him. Secondly, the distribution of his remaining belongings, his clothes. And then lastly, the sign which is written about him. First of all, Mark tells us that they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. At first glance, you might think that's an act of compassion from the Romans. Here you are, mate, you're getting it pretty rough. Give you some wine. Of course, some wine would have its narcotic benefits to it, numbing and easing the pain, making it easier for the person to suffer less so. And one might think that was an act of compassion, a bit like a last meal for someone on death row. But in fact, it was much more unlikely that. It was more, yes, it would numb the pain, but much more likely to prolong the time and agony which was required to suffer slowly. But Jesus says no. Remember the vow that he's made just hours before at the Last Supper. As Jesus shares the cup, he says, take this, drink this. This is the blood of the new covenant. He then says these words in Mark 14:25. Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of heaven. He was destined to drink the cup of God, not of man. He says no, remaining fully present and conscious, enduring the pain. Then secondly, it was the division of the clothing that he had remaining. Mark tells us that they crucified him, they divide up his clothes, and they cast lots to see what each one would get. Now, it was common practice, again, for the executioners to gather the belongings of their victim who was being crucified. It was part of the deal, I guess. Mark draws our attention to it and relates specifically to what's written in Psalm 22, verse 18. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. Now, again, if we delve deeper into this, we see some deeper meaning and deeper significance to what's actually going on. First of all, garments to Jesus were important. The lady was healed just by touching the hem of his garment. On the Mount of Transfiguration, his garments glowed with this brilliant light. Then just hours before this, he is given a purple robe of royalty to wear. And now at the final moment, his final belongings are taken from him literally and given as spoil to his Roman executioners. They divide up his clothing and they're stuck with this conundrum. In utter humiliation, his last piece of clothing, his underwear. And this second point, we need to go to John's version to understand a bit more fully because he gives us a bit more insight. Let's read John 19. When the soldiers crucified him, they took his clothes and they divide them into 4 shares. So his outer clothing, the 4 soldiers, they all get a bit of it. Now, when it gets to his undergarment, this was seamless. It was just one piece of cloth from the top to bottom. And the soldiers, they say, let's not tear it. They said, let's decide by lot who'll get it. This happened to fulfill the scriptures, Psalm 22. So they divided up and they used like different, it's almost like dice what we would have, and they would cast lots, they would throw things, and it falls to one person to get this remaining garment. Now, why are we going into so much detail? Well, a couple of things. First of all, in Exodus, write that down if you're taking notes, 28, 31, 32. Aaron, Moses' brother, becomes the first high priest. And the high priest has an ornate priestly robe to wear that signifies who he is, this special position. The high priest that acts between the people and God, the people and the presence of God, and acts in between. And so passed down to Moses through his brother Aaron is this priestly robe, which is made of one piece of cloth from top to bottom, and it is not to be torn. However, tearing clothes in that culture, in that context, was a traditional thing. Someone had died, person's grieving, a person is angry. To tear one's clothing was an outward symbol, an act showing an inner demonstration of pain. And it was something which was cultural and was seen by others during that time. But according to Leviticus 21 and 10, no tearing of clothing was permitted for a high priest. And so whilst it was an act which was commonplace to all, the high priests themselves was not allowed, not permitted to tear their own clothing. And yet what we learned last week, when Jesus says, in answer to the question, are you the Messiah? Jesus says, I am, and you'll see me at the right hand of the Father, coming on the clouds of glory. In that admission of what the high priest thought was blasphemy, the high priest Caiaphas, what did he do? He tore his priestly robes. He physically tears them, and yet was not permitted to do so. Let's pay attention. What's going on in this incredibly terrible, awful hour, like the curtain that was torn in two at the point of Jesus' death, signifying this open access to the presence of God for all people, for all times. We learn here that Caiaphas, the high priest, tears his clothing, and in this act, this priestly act, he tears his clothing, and in Jesus' last moment, his underwear, his clothing is not torn. And the high priest of Caiaphas is passed in that moment to Jesus, the high priest of all high priests, and the high priest for all time and all kingdom. I don't know about you, but that's pretty cool. That's pretty special. And in his death, the access, the way, he is the way. He opens up this way so we don't have to go through a high priest. We don't have to sacrifice a lamb because his sacrifice is for all. It's for all. It's the gospel. It's the good news. So it doesn't matter what we've done. Jesus' blood was enough, and by his stripes we are healed. The iniquities of the world, the transgressions of ourselves in the four walls, and the broken, hurting world, and the messed up stuff that we see outside these four walls, his blood was enough. His sacrifice was for all. He is and will always be our great high priest. And lastly, and we'll land, the written notice of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. Throughout Jesus' time, he averted the desire for some of his followers and the crowds to entertain the political world. And yet, Jesus is crucified as a messianic king. And what's written and what he carries as he attempts to carry his crossbeam through the streets, and as he is crucified, the sign above him reads, the King of the Jews. And again, in John's account, we read, the chief priests, they're annoyed. They're like, why'd you write that? You should have written that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. He's not the King of the Jews. We just said that so he would get killed. The irony of it all. So in the end, on this morning at 9 o'clock, Jesus is nailed to the cross. Naked, beaten, humiliated, scorned, in front of his mother, in front of the female followers. Only John made it. Only John. The chief priests, they're there. Centurion and the other soldiers, they're there. And many other onlookers. He is left there, nailed between two others. Jesus has spent 33 years in the company of sinners. And he's hanging there between to sinners.
Thanks for listening to the Carrickfergus Vineyard podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our church, please visit our website at carrickfergusvineyard.org.